My name is Robert Brockway, and I will be presenting a speech by Peter Ryan, the anti-gynocentrist. I will begin this speech quoting Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. For many years, there has been an unquestioned assumption in the manosphere and in our wider gynocentric culture that because women are the rate-limiting factor of reproduction, women are more valuable than men and men are disposable. It is perhaps one of the biggest blue pill myths there is, and a sacred cow belief of our gynocentric culture. This core assumption underpins so many of the rationalizations given for justifying gynocentric bigotry towards men, that unless it is addressed and exposed for the distorted and factually wrong interpretation of biology that it is, nothing much is going to change for men. The glorification of the female role in reproduction is an old idea and widely held. However, like what we have seen with obsolete ideas such as the Earth being flat and the Earth being the centre of the universe, just because an idea is old and widely held as the truth, does not then make it right. Let me get something straightened out right off the bat. Women do not create life, men and women create life. This should be an obvious fact, and yet the line, women create life, is mentioned frequently enough in our gynocentric culture to be mindlessly accepted and repeated like it is common knowledge. To put it bluntly, functioning as an incubator does not make a woman a real mother, let alone a more valuable human being or the sole creator of life. The narcissism surrounding the role of women in reproduction needs to be confronted in our culture and put down a peg. If we are to address the serious matters surrounding the epidemic of fatherlessness in our society. Fatherlessness is not just a legal issue, it is a social and cultural issue, now in the West as well. A real mother respects fatherhood. With that opening statement, I will now embark on dismantling the pseudo-scientific dogma surrounding the golden uterus in a number of topics during this talk. The golden uterus is not just used to elevate motherhood undeservedly over fatherhood, it is also used to argue why women are more valuable human beings. The tale of two tribes scenario. You have probably heard the tale of two tribes scenario a million times before. A community of one man and 999 women is far better off than a community of 999 men and one woman. We are told the community with more women will replace itself and the community with a single woman will perish. It is certainly true that in such an extreme example, the community with just one single woman is likely to perish. However, it is also likely, although perhaps less likely, for the community with a single man to also perish in such a scenario. Genetic diversity may not be sufficient for the community to recover, or there may not be the manpower available to ensure there is sufficient resources, shelter and protection for the community. The lone male may not even be fertile enough to ensure sufficient numbers of offspring are reproduced. It could even be that some sort of mixture of all three factors may result in the community with a single male perishing. There is a big issue, though, with the tale of two tribes. It is misleading. What may be correct at one population size with certain sex ratios may not apply to another population size with different sex ratios. For example, what if there were 900 men and 100 women, or 99,000 men and 1,000 women, or 600 men and 400 women? Will they still perish? In such circumstances, the community may shrink temporarily but may not perish, and are likely to recover in a few generations. The reproductive fitness outcomes that apply at one scale of population, size and sex ratio may not apply to another. So taking such extreme examples of one man and 999 women, or 999 men and one woman, and then formulating a universal law that says women are more valuable than men, is both misleading and factually incorrect. Having such skewed numbers as 999 men and one woman, or 999 women and one man, represent very extreme scenarios. The likelihood of them arising is very rare in the actual historic and prehistoric past, and may not have even happened at all. It is much more likely that for most of human history and prehistory, sex ratios between men and women in communities have been much more even. Indeed, we are biologically predisposed to have a roughly 1-to-1 sex ratio at birth, which is explained by an evolutionary concept called Fisher's principle. It has hardly been the norm that communities have prolonged periods where there have been such heavily skewed sex ratios that women make up only 0.1% of the population. such as in the two tribes scenario with 1 woman and 999 men. Although there may have been periods where there were a few more men or women in communities, such periods have been temporary, and the sex ratios, while a little imbalanced, would rarely if ever have reached the extremes of 1 woman or to 999 men or vice versa. While sex ratios do vary with age cohorts and temporary imbalances can arise in a population as a whole, the overall sex ratio of men and women eventually gravitates back to 1:1, as explained by Fisher's principle. If one sex becomes scarce, then there is a selective pressure for there to be greater parental investment in producing the minority sex in future generations until the sex ratio reaches 1:1. Such sex ratio imbalances that do arise are eventually gone in a generation or two and simply cannot be used to explain any protective bias towards women. I will explain this evolutionary principle in detail later on in this speech. I put all of this out to drive home the ridiculousness of the tale of the two tribes scenario in arguing such scenarios explain why society has evolved a bias to protect women over men. Such an explanation is only plausible if we assume that the two tribes scenario represents the demographics of human societies over a prolonged period of time, in which natural selection had the opportunity to select for a psychological bias to protect women over men on this basis. If it was the case that human societies often had only the bare minimum number of women to ensure their continuation for thousands of years, then it would follow humans would have evolved a trait to protect women over men simply due to women being the rate-limiting factor, the rate-limiting reproduction, and being in such consistently short supply. However, human societies for most of human history and prehistory have likely had a surplus number of women that was significant beyond the bare minimum required to ensure the continuation of the community. A community of 150 men and 150 women, for example, may only require 10 of the women not to perish. It takes a very extreme scenario indeed for a community to reach a point where the loss of one or more woman leads the community to die out. Even if we were to go to the low numbers of 100 people with 60 men and 40 women, for instance, just a fraction of those women would be the bare minimum required to ensure the community produces enough offspring to continue its existence. Over just a generation or two, the community population size can eventually recover from extreme shocks if large numbers of the women in a society and the population as a whole are lost, as the young replace those people. Human societies can recover from population bottlenecks with only low numbers of men and women, as long as the numbers of each sex don't drop below the bare minimum required to produce a minimum level offspring to perpetuate society. The fixation on reproduction and life history theory. A key reason why the tale of two tribes scenario gains traction is because of the simplicity of it. Simple ideas might be appealing, but as we see with the feminist gender wage gap, they are misleading. The two tribes scenario masks a very complicated process of ensuring a lineage, a community, and a species continues. Reproduction, whilst important to the continuation of a lineage and community, etc., is not the only factor that is essential. Individuals must survive and develop well enough to live to sexual maturity, attract mates, reproduce at an optimal rate, and care for the resulting offspring. Those offspring in turn must also survive and develop to sexual maturity. Reproduction is a dead end if the offspring die before they reproduce, and reproduction cannot even occur if people do not survive long enough to mate. There must also be a certain level of genetic diversity in the population to ensure offspring are healthy enough to reproduce healthy offspring of their own. It is not enough to simply breed offspring. The offspring and their parents have to be healthy, fertile, and survive. In actual biological reality, reproduction is just one component in a chain of activities required to propagate the genome. Life history theory and evolutionary biology states the numerous balances and trade-offs that organisms make in their survival, development, and reproduction activities across their lifespan to optimize their reproductive success or evolutionary success. Human beings reproduce at relatively low rates compared to other species and have a very long developmental period, precisely because there is more to evolutionary success than just maximizing reproduction. Unlike microbial life, humans are organisms with a slow life history strategy that places a lower priority on the rate of reproduction. Having high numbers of women in a community and maximize the rate of reproduction of a community is not the be-all and end-all to evolutionary success that it is made out to be. In reality, the role of women in reproduction is just one component of a much bigger and far more complex life history equation. The fixation on women being the rate-limiting factor of reproduction blinds people to the bigger picture. The reproductive success of human communities is the result of many factors working together in a complex interdependent system, and is not just determined by how many uteri you have. Think of all of the activities that have to occur in a human community aside from reproduction and gestation that are related to survival to ensure a healthy, fertile offspring are born and properly develop and the community and the resultant offspring survive. Think of the role of men in ensuring those activities are adequately performed, particularly when women are pregnant or preoccupied with looking after small infants. Think of the extreme survival challenges our ancestors faced in environments across the world before modern civilization, and the role of men in such a context. Even today, our societies are utterly dependent on men to keep them running. Whilst some may argue technology may eventually make men's role in community survival redundant, the same can be said for women and their role in reproduction with the eventual development of artificial uteri. However, it is worth noting such developments for either sex are a long way off, and in many respects it will be harder to replace men given the greater multitude of tasks men perform, including repairing the very robots and machines that supposedly will replace them. With deeper reflection, I can see that simply making the claim that women being the rate of limiting factor of reproduction makes them more valuable assumes that there are not a multitude of other factors that are just as essential to assuring the future of the community. Let us consider this with some detail in relation to the evolutionary environment humans have lived in most of their history and prehistory. 1. Any community is going to require a minimum number of men and women to reproduce. 2. Any community will also require a minimum number of men and women to ensure sufficient levels of genetic diversity. 3. A certain minimum amount of investment in survival will also be required to ensure the community has adequate food, water, resources, shelter, and protection to keep everyone alive. And 4. The community environment must have the carrying capacity or resources available to support population. As can be seen with that simple description, we discover that it is not just about having enough women to reproduce. A certain number of men are also going to be required. The exact number of men and women required to ensure a community does not perish may actually require more men in some instances. It is also the case that a certain minimum amount of resources or habitat carrying capacity will be required to support the population. Simply focusing on maximizing reproduction is almost doomed to fail, because the resulting population growth will eventually collapse the food chain and ecosystem, and the community will perish. Reproduction has to be maintained at a level that can be sustained by the carrying capacity of the habitat of the community that the community finds itself in. Not all environments are lush jungles with a high carrying capacity, easy access to food and water, no predators, and plenty of available shelter. Many environments on this planet have a low carrying capacity. Food and water is hard to collect or grow, and shelter is difficult to find or construct. Many habitats, like the African savanna, have dangerous predators lurking around, and the weather and geological conditions are harsh. Think Siberia and the numerous deserts. Not all habitats are paradise, and humans have had to adapt to all of them and survive. Whilst women may be the rate-limiting factor of reproduction, men do play a disproportionate role in undertaking risky and physically demanding work required for community survival. Of course, there is overlap between the sexes in these domains, but there is a substantial difference on average when considering the relative contributions of each sex as a whole in these areas. If women are the rate-limiting factor of reproduction, then men are the rate-limiting factor of survival. When you consider pregnant women and women raising small infants in a prehistoric context, or even as early as 150 years ago, and the harsh living conditions that human communities face across different environments, it does not take a rocket scientist to understand the importance of men in undertaking physically challenging and dangerous tasks related to community survival. The reality is that raising small infants and simply gathering food with relatively little physical effort compared to hunting is not enough to survive in many environments throughout the world. It is also the fact that in many places throughout the world, the carrying capacity of the environment may not be able to support large population growth, and low rates of reproduction may actually be advantageous. In some environments, reproduction may be less critical to the future of the community, and there may actually be pressures related to survival that matter more. In such contexts, a higher minimum amount of men and women may actually be required. In other contexts, more women may be advantageous. It does not always follow that more women are needed than men, because golden uterus. We must also consider that there is a difference between the minimum number of men and women required to perpetuate a community and the optimal number of men and women required for a community to thrive. A community may indeed continue to eke out an existence with only 10 men and 990 women, but that does not mean it will thrive and does not suffer greater costs. Having more men may allow such communities to thrive to a point where they become resistant to the very shocks that threaten to wipe out the community in the first place. As with the minimum number of men and women required to sustain a community, different environments, demographics, and living conditions may mean, in some instances, greater numbers of men are more important to a community thriving, and in other instances, women may be more important. Natural selection does not favour just when this is what is required at a minimum. It also preferentially selects what is optimal. A community of 500 men and 500 women that thrives over a community of 10 men and 990 women will consequently be favoured under natural selection. None of any of this detail is considered if we assume the number of uteri in a community is the sole determinant of reproducing success and biological value. None of the complexity of what it takes for a community to continue its existence is considered. This is what reproductive reductionism admits. Fisher's principle, the biological system of males and females. The fundamental truth, which is consistently ignored by reproductive reductionists, despite it being well established within the field of evolutionary biology, is that biology does not value or favour the existence of one sex over the other in our species. This reality is reflected in the equal parenting investment in reproducing males and females. Fisher's principle is an evolutionary concept that explains why the sex ratio of many sexually reproducing species, including humans, is roughly 1-to-1, and why parental investment in male and female offspring is equal. Fisher's principle can be illustrated as follows. 1. Assume there are less males than females in a given population. The males will have a higher rate of reproduction per individual than individual females, as the total reproductive output of each sex is equal, but distributed among fewer numbers of males. 3. Consequently, parents that reproduce males are at an evolutionary advantage, as their offspring will be more reproductively successful per individual than if they had produced females. 4. As a result, over time, parents will produce more male offspring as it is selectively advantageous. 5. Greater parental investment in male offspring will continue until the number of males and females in the population equalizes and the reproductive advantage of male offspring enjoy reduces to 0. Fisher's principle describes a form of equilibrium where parental investment in males and females will be equal. The core reason for this equality is because the total reproductive output of men and women as a whole is exactly equal. Neither sex as a whole can produce a greater number of offspring than the other sex and get a leg up. It is mathematically impossible. For every child that is conceived, there has to be one male parent and one female parent. The result is that the male and female sex have the same biological value in evolutionary terms as total reproductive access for each sex as a whole is equal. There is no long-term evolutionary advantage to producing female offspring over male offspring or vice versa. Some will no doubt point out that human beings have a sex ratio at birth of roughly 1.05 males to 1 female. This does not invalidate Fisher's principle, but is actually supported by it. Geneticist Ronald Fisher, the author of Fisher's principle, explained the slight deviation from the 1-to-1 sex ratio as a compensatory mechanism for the higher rate of male infant mortality. The higher rate of male infant mortality drives larger numbers of males to be born to ensure equal parenting expenditure in producing male and female offspring. that actually reach sexual maturity. There is no grand gynocentric conspiracy by nature to favour females over males. Nature does not have a favourite. There is equal biological investment in producing each sex, because each sex has the same overall reproductive success. The distribution of that reproductive success between individuals may differ by sex, but not by the total output. Fewer men may reproduce, but each of those men that do reproduce will be with a higher frequency than any individual women. That is the part which is left out when people discuss fewer men reproducing than women. There is no argument to be made that women are somehow more important than men because more women reproduced. Such arguments can simply be countered by pointing to the higher reproductive success of the individual men that do reproduce. Genghis Khan, anyone? We have had half of the population chromosomal XX female and the other half XY in our lineage for at least 160 million years since our current sex determination system came into being. That is 160 million years of natural selection tolerating half the population not directly giving birth to offspring. Supercontinents have broken up and major geological and extinction level events have occurred in that period of time, including the extinction of the dinosaurs. There's been plenty of time for natural selection to alter the reproductive paradigm at some point with our evolutionary predecessors, so that all of the members of our species give birth, as if that was all that mattered and it was so crucial. Our evolutionary predecessors could have evolved back to asexual reproduction or become hermaphrodites in that period of time. 160 million years is not a trivial time span, even when we consider the slow process of evolution. 160 million years is a very long block of time to be stuck with a maladaptive strategy of wasting half of the genome, especially when we consider the extinction events that have occurred over that period of time. Species have emerged and then vanished in much smaller timescales than 160 million years. Despite all of the time that has passed, our lineage settled on an evolutionary track where only half the population internally gestates the offspring for 9 months. This reproductive strategy is a result of millions of years of natural selection and not an accident. It is a strategy that does not maximize reproduction, and yet it has actually been favored by natural selection in our evolutionary branch. Why? It is not reproduction alone that determines evolutionary success, but rather the right combination of investment in survival, development, and reproduction that determines our evolutionary success. There is a selective advantage in having only one sex give birth to offspring and having the other half of the population available and sexually selected to focus on their efforts on other strategies related to survival. It allows for a broader, more sophisticated, and more robust strategy in adapting to the environment to maximize evolutionary success. The biological roles of each sex support each other in an interdependent system. This allows activities related to survival and reproduction to be enhanced to produce outputs beyond what would otherwise be possible. In systems theory, this is called synergy and emergence. The sum becomes greater than the individual parts of their own, and new properties emerge when the components work together as a whole. This is what reproductive reductionists miss when they just focus on women and reproduction. Human civilization is arguably one emergent property of the foundational sociobiological system that has evolved around the specialized roles of men and women. It is the overall end result of men and women working together that matters, not the golden uterus. The fallacy of male biological disposability. The concept of men being biologically disposable is just as ludicrous as the concept that women are more valuable because they have a uterus. Our gynocentric culture may indeed treat men as if they are disposable, but that does not mean they are in biological terms. That does not mean that in biological terms they are disposable. The mere existence of bigoted beliefs and behaviours that promote a premise that one group of people is disposable does not then translate to such a belief and behaviours having a justifiable basis in reality. 6 million Jews were considered disposable based on nothing more than outright hatred. All sorts of pseudo-scientific justifications were given to assert that they were subhuman. The claim men are biologically disposable is a lie embedded within gynocentric elements of our culture to exploit men. It is a lie the manosphere should reject and expose for the rubbish that it is. Any society that wants to survive and thrive has the best chance of doing so when it has large numbers of healthy men to provide the manpower to support it. Losing men costs society. Even in war, it makes little sense to lose men in battle if it can be avoided. Those armies that win battles with the least amount of men lost win wars. The loss of men means the loss of available manpower and all of the value to society in armies that comes with that manpower. Disposability implies indifference towards the loss of male life, and any society that exercises such indifference jeopardizes its own future and eventually is replaced by societies that do not demonstrate such indifference. Natural selection does not favour men that lose their lives in a war or from performing dangerous tasks. It favours men that survive such challenges. Men are no more disposable in performing their roles in society than women are in dying during childbirth. Both are costs that functional societies and natural selection seek to reduce. The reason men go off to war and are encouraged to do the risky and dangerous tasks in society is not because society considers them less valuable than women. It is because men are better equipped to undertake those tasks. Men have evolved strengths to perform these tasks more so than women. Just think of how sex differences play out in the special forces of our military, for example. There's been considerable loss of male life throughout history, and that is not automatically a reflection of society being indifferent towards the loss of men. We have Anzac Day, Remembrance Day, and Memorial Day for a reason, because society does care when men lose their lives and understands the societal cost. If we were completely indifferent towards men's lives, no such days would exist. That is the dysfunctional society feminists and gynocentric traditionalists before them have been driving us towards. A society where men can be exploited with complete societal indifference, or even ridiculed for their sacrifice. Misandry in society definitely exists, but we need to delineate the bigotry based on hatred and sophistry from actual biological reality. Female neoteny, male competition, and the gender empathy gap. Some point to the sex differences in neoteny and the gender empathy gap as proof that females are more valuable than males. I would argue instead that neoteny is at the least partly the result of sex difference in reproductive strategies and mating preferences, rather than a difference in biological value. Men sexually select for neoteny in women because that signals youth, which is a marker of fertility, and women select for less neoteny in men because that signals strength. The male sex gains more from intersexual competition, and a lower degree of neoteny is advantageous in the context in which men compete. The greater intersexual competition of the male sex is not the result of men having a lower biological value, but is instead an example of male biological value manifesting itself. Competition for men is one way they make use of their talents, and men gain far more reproductively from successful competition than women can, because men can reproduce many more offspring from the status they acquire. Competition between men has literally built civilization and has driven enormous levels of innovation and advancement. The greater intersexual competition of men is not proof of male inferiority, but simply a reflection of the greater returns in reproductive fitness that men acquire from investing in such competition, and a means of generating survival value, which in turn boosts reproductive fitness. It bears repeating that the acts directly related to reproduction, like gestation, are not the only form of deriving biological value. The gender empathy gap is real, and I am certainly not denying its existence. I'm also fairly certain there is at least this very little biological predisposition at an emotional level to have a greater concern for female well-being. However, this gender empathy gap does not result from women being more biologically valuable than men, because they are at the rate-limiting factor of reproduction. Over millions of years of evolution, women and their female primate ancestors have developed physical, physiological, and social traits to elicit greater social support from their peers. Men have not developed these traits to the same degree that women have. Why is that so? The reason is not because women are more valuable than men. It is because women and men have different strategies for maximizing reproductive success and different forms of biological value. As I have discussed earlier, men benefit considerably more from intersexual competition than women, as they can produce far more offspring from doing so. Men also have greater availability to engage in activities that are not directly related to reproduction, that enhances the survival of the community and offspring, as they do not have to gestate offspring. This survival value that men generate allows them to acquire status and influence within a community and access to potential mates. It can also be utilised to improve the health of their offspring and related kin and the wider community they belong to. Just like the case with intersexual competition, these activities can boost men's reproductive success in ways it cannot for women, because men can father hundreds of offspring from the status they derive from these activities, and can also better perform these activities without the added burden of pregnancy. Many of these activities men engage in to provide survival value involve risks, competition, and are labour-intensive. The risks and costs can be high, but the reproductive payoff can be huge. The competitive, risky, demanding activities men engage in to harness their intrinsic value and inherent abilities to generate survival value for the community, related kin and offspring, requires a higher level of self-reliance and independence. Being reliant on eliciting social support is to at least some degree less compatible with the means through which men maximise reproductive success in comparison to what the case is for women. In contrast, women during pregnancy and immediately after childbirth are less able to provide for themselves. They are also very preoccupied with raising small infants and breastfeeding them after giving birth. This was a physical reality that had to be factored into how society was structured for thousands of years, until birth control and modern technological advancements. Before birth control, women may have faced multiple periods of pregnancy during their life under very harsh conditions, caring for multiple offspring. In such contexts, there would have been unique advantages for women in being able to garner social support from the community to boost female reproductive success. It is predictable they would have evolved strengths to elicit that support. It is the asymmetry in how each sex maximises their reproductive success that leads to the sex differences underpinning the empathy gap. Empathy from society is more advantageous to female reproductive success than it is to male reproductive success. This difference may also have other major factors driving the sex differences that we see in neoteny. It is certainly the case that each sex benefits from eliciting social support from other people, and there is certainly overlap. We are not talking about a black and white dichotomy. However, there is a greater advantage for women in receiving social support and a greater advantage for men in being self-reliant in terms of reproductive fitness. This leads to sex differences developing where women have greater physical and psychological traits to elicit social support from society than men. What are the biological origins of gynocentrism? The biological origins of gynocentrism do not lie in a difference in overall biological value between men and women. The root of gynocentrism lies in the difference between male and female reproductive strategies, and the conflict that can arise when those two strategies oppose each other. Gynocentrism is an example of what is called sexual conflict in evolutionary biology. Sexual conflict is a phenomenon in which one sex deploys an antagonistic strategy to gain a reproductive fitness advantage at the expense of the other sex. The sexual cannibalism of the male spider being eaten by the female spider is one example of sexual conflict in the animal kingdom. Sexual coercion or rape of females, seen in many species and not just humans, is another example of sexual conflict. Although it is important to acknowledge that there is a considerable degree of intersexual cooperation in our species, there is also, to a certain extent, a literal biological battle of the sexes underway in our society. Slogans like, "The future is female," and articles like, "Why can't we have men?" say it all. Gynocentrism primarily results from a pathological overexpression of the greater emotional predisposition society has to feel empathy for women relative to men. There are certainly other factors at play, but the overarching force at the core of gynocentrism is the gender empathy gap. Whilst the predisposition to feel greater empathy for women exists, this biological predisposition is not a biological inevitability on its own. Humans can and do have the capacity to control and override their emotional impulses. Impulse control centers in the brain such as the prefrontal cortex allow people to act on their impulses and emotional drives in an intelligent and strategic way in respect of their social environment. Healthy people are not slaves to their impulses, only addicts are. With that said, our underlying emotional bias can still make us vulnerable to well-executed social manipulation by others and can be exploited. Gynocentrism is the end result of the weaponization of female hypoagency by specific and well-organized coalitions of women. Yes, it is true, not all women are like that, but there are specific groups of women that have been and continue to be the architects and cheerleaders of gynocentrism. Like men, some women are good people and some women are bad people. The coalitions of women I am talking about generally come in two flavors: gynocentric traditionalists and feminists. Together with their male lackeys, they have gradually undermined the relations between the sexes over the centuries and recent decades to the dysfunctional state we see today. The emotional bias we have to care for women and to protect them has been exploited by those groups of women to manipulate society, and specifically men, over many centuries to elevate women over men. Karen Strong called it the tyranny of female hypoagency. This antagonistic female sexual conflict strategy has, over the course of many centuries, subverted our culture. Traditional gynocentric social narratives, like romantic chivalry in past centuries, and feminist narratives like patriarchy theory in the modern era, have been developed by these women whilst they have been in positions of authority, wealth and privilege. These women have used their positions of influence in the upper classes of society, in academia, the legal system, journalism and elsewhere, to spread these gynocentric narratives throughout governments, courts, institutions, media and wider society. The narratives promote an exaggerated image of female vulnerability and have been designed to exploit our emotional bias to feel empathy for women to further an agenda. These narratives have been deployed to gradually transform our culture over decades and centuries into the gynocentric culture we have today. There's been an ongoing process of cultural subversion from generation to generation under the camouflage of female vulnerability. Our laws, our institutions, our social norms, our societal attitudes towards men and women, and the account of our own history and knowledge of the sexes have all been gradually warped and rewritten by these powerful gynocentric social narratives. Narratives that exploit our emotional bias to perceive women as helpless and as victims in need of support and rescue from men and society. The end goal of the underlying agenda is clear. Once the crocodile tears are wiped away and the mask of female vulnerability and hypoagency is removed, gynocentrism leads to a dysfunctional sexual feudal system where women hold a privileged position in society in relation to men, and eventually the complete dehumanization of men. Gynocentrism is in essence female supremacy under the guise of female vulnerability. Nature abhors a vacuum. As with any imbalance, sooner or later it comes to an end. Gynocentrism, or any form of sexual conflict for that matter, that grows to a point where it negatively impacts the overall reproductive fitness of a population, will be selected against. The mismatch between the marginalization of men in gynocentric societies and the female hypergamy is a major factor causing the fertility rates of many countries to fall below replacement levels. There is no middle ground with gynocentrism, and it inevitably grows to a point where it undermines the foundations of society. Gynocentrism is essentially a snake that eventually eats its own tail. It is a long process over many centuries of initial growth and then decline, but eventually gynocentric culture destroys itself. It is important to note that while the potential for sexual conflict in our species does exist, so does the potential to adopt a strategy of intersexual cooperation. Eventually, functionally adaptive strategies for the species win out, and any population that adopts the more optimal cooperative strategy and does not marginalize men will eventually end up replacing the declining gynocentric societies around them. There are many other forces at work that play into this gynocentric social manipulation and amplify its effects by orders of magnitude, and I cannot address them all in this speech. I will be discussing the origins of gynocentrism further and what is driving it in further detail in my future articles, and also presenting possible solutions. People can learn more about the many flaws of reproductive reductionism and the myth of the golden uterus by reading my articles on the subject on my website, theantigynocentrist.com. gynocentrism.wordpress.com, and in my lecture series on gynocentrism.com, where I've gone into even greater detail on these topics than in this speech. Humans are no more a gynocentric species than we are a murderous species and a tribalistic and genocidal species. All behaviour, and I do mean all behaviour, including murder, rape, tribalism, genocide, has a biological component, and humans do have a biological predisposition for violence. We don't make biological determinist justifications for murder, rape, racism, genocide, or violence, and we should not do so for gynocentrism either.